Good morning, everyone, and welcome to yet another webinar by Coolset. Welcome to the second edition of our EUDR summer school. For those that were last time, you'll have a bit of a background on what we're talking about today. For those that weren't able to join last time, we'll have a bit of a recap and be sure to kind of build on that as well. As usual, we see people still coming in. Probably finding the link in their inbox, just trying to get access to the online environment. So just to give you a bit of an introduction, we're going to talk about risk assessments under EUDR today. Those that have already looked into EUDR a bit, you might know that this is quite a complicated and elaborate stage that is part of EUDR. We're looking forward to explaining that to you today and then taking you through that journey. We've broken it down in kind of the more theoretical steps to give you an indication of, okay, what does the regulation actually ask of us? And then, of course, we make it more practical by going into the case study that we've prepared for you today. So I think we can go over to the agenda. So today we're going to talk about the second session, which is kind of to look at EUDR. And then the plan for today is to go over. Sorry, there's always a bit of a delay in the slides, so we're going to try to make that as smooth as possible. But in today's sessions, we're talking about risk assessment under EUDR. 2 weeks ago, we talked about collecting data for EUDR, and the next session, which is in 2 weeks on the 13th of August, we're going to be talking about submitting your due diligence statement, which, as you also learned today, kind of really brings it all together. So that contains all of the information that we're discussing today and also on the last 2 webinar sessions. Now we can actually go to the agenda. So we're talking about the due diligence process, what it entails. Then we're going to go over the background on risk assessments and mitigation, which are Article 10 and 11 of the EUDR. More on that later. Then we're talking about what's the difference between negligible risk and non-negligible, and how do you deal with that? And then Elizabeth is going to make it really practical for you to kind of take it beyond the steps of the theoretics and make it practical with a case study, which we have made quite extensive in order to really take you on that kind of journey of what it means for a company to report on EUDR and then specifically on the risk assessment. And then, of course, as we always do, we have allocated quite some time for the Q&A. As we know that the EUDR is quite complex, and we know that some of you might have specific questions. We'll try and answer all of those. Please add your questions in the question box on the bottom right. That gives us kind of the environment where we can track all of them and also put them on the screen when we answer them. So that makes it easier for everyone attending to see what we're discussing. So once again, put your question in the bottom right. If you have one, feel free to add them throughout the webinar, and then we'll get back to it during the Q&A. First, a quick question to kick it off and to kind of see where people stand. What commodities do you import/trade? Here we have the 7 EUDR commodities, but we also have the option of not reporting for companies that perhaps are not directly reporting companies, but want to know more about EUDR. So let's see what people report. I'm seeing, from the companies that are reporting, most are reporting on wood with around 30%, 20% are not reporting. And then after that, we see right now 13% also import or trade palm oil, followed by rubber, cattle, and cocoa. And then we see that soy and coffee are quite low with only 5% and 7%. This question is also multiple choice. So of course, there may be an overlap. We also know that many companies import several commodities. So good to see that, there's a good distribution with wood taking the lead with 31%. So now let's have a look at the EUDR due diligence process and kind of take you through the legal foundation of what we're discussing today. So the EUDR basically starts with a lot of paragraphs. And before we go into the paragraphs that we're discussing today, which is paragraph 10 and 11, let's start with paragraph or Article 8, which discusses a bit or like breaks down the due diligence statement. So what we've done here is we've really just kind of taken the very literal definition of that article and put it in the slide. And I'll just give you a quick rundown. Yes, it's very technical, it's quite boring, but I think it's a good foundation to build the rest of the webinar on. So the first paragraph of Article 8 states, prior to placing relevant products on the market or exporting them, operators shall exercise due diligence with regard to all relevant products supplied by each particular supplier. Paragraph 2, the due diligence shall include the collection of information, data, and documents needed to fulfill the requirements set out in Article 9, risk assessment measures as referred to in Article 10, and risk mitigation measures as referred to in Article 11. So what we're doing here is kind of in these 3 sessions, is last session we talked about Article 9, in today's session we're talking about Article 10 and 11, and then in the next session we're bringing that all together under the due diligence statement, which requires input on these 3 articles, which then also becomes more clear as we've taken the time to highlight these two things here, so that you also know what specifically is the topic for today. So moving on, what are the basic elements of EUDR? Kind of a bit of a more practical version of the last slide. So the first step is to collect the data to fulfill the requirements of Article 9. And basically that means, what that means is to set a minimum data environment kind of to collect per order, which means the shipment data, the harvest and information data, but also information of deforestation-free and legal materials. So that requires you, for example, to look at things like satellite imaging. So what is your plot certified deforestation-free? Do you have all the relevant documentation from your suppliers, for example? And once you have that, you go on to the next step, which is to do the risk assessment. And here you analyze the collected information and determine if there's any risk that the product is non-compliant due to non-negligible risks. And the step that comes after that, step 3, is conditional on step 2, because if your risk is non-negligible, then you have to go to step 3. If your risk is negligible because you've kind of fulfilled all the conditions of negligibility, so to say, you can skip that part. But essentially, most companies will ultimately move on to step 3, which is to do the risk mitigation. And here you eliminate or mitigate any risks if needed before moving on with the importing or distributing of materials. So what does that mean in practice? First of all, operators must retain a due diligence process that includes the 3 steps. So you always have to focus on these 3 steps, which are Article 9, 10, and 11. And you must bring that together in your due diligence report. There are no circumstances where you can kind of skip that part if you import one of the EUDR-related commodities. There are, of course, exemptions for low-risk countries, but that's something we'll discuss more in the next couple of slides as well. These steps also must be ensured for every order. And lastly, the due diligence process must be implemented before the materials are distributed to the customers. What that basically means is that if you have an EUDR-related commodity that you're importing or trading, you need to have done these steps before they can actually be sold to the customer. So what are the differences between Article 9 and Article 10? Article 9 is also titled Information Requirements, and looks at ensuring that the product itself is deforestation-free and legally produced. And it also verifies compliance on paper. If you want to know more about that and you haven't attended our last webinar, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to share the link with you. And then for Article 10, which we're talking about today, that really goes about the risk assessments and adds contextual risk analysis and evaluates the broader risk environment. And we're going to make as clear as possible what that means by breaking it down in very kind of practical steps that you can take in order to do a risk assessment for your commodities. So before we do that, I'm also really curious if people already know what continents they're importing from. And yeah, just to also give us an indication of where the data quality stands today, and if you've already mapped that process. Let me add that question. Let me see. Here we go. I'm going to put it live now. You should be able to see the question appear on your screen now. Of course, once again, the option for not reporting. So here we have a couple of options, also multiple choice. Curious to see. So we're seeing here most companies that report are importing or trading from within Europe with 27%, and then followed by Asia with 22%. South America with 14% right now, and North America with 10%, Africa 6%, and Oceania has 2%. So I think that's a pretty interesting also discussion. I was expecting kind of more to come from outside of Europe, but also, really interesting to see that actually that's the highest number with 25%, which also says something about kind of the future of EUDR, as there are discussions about changing kind of the risk categories, but also for those that import already from within the Europe, under the current setting, importing low risk commodities from low risk countries, which makes the due diligence process somewhat easier. Okay, moving on. Let's have a look at the legal background, which is kind of the foundation of the risk assessment. So what is Article 10? The Article 10 focuses on many things, but we just broke it down in kind of clear steps that should be considered. This includes the presence of forests, but also deforestation. But it also looks at indigenous people in the country. It looks at reliability of information. It looks at governance characteristics, but also supply chain complexity, mixing and processing. Also a history of non-compliance or substantiated concerns. And lastly, certifications and voluntary schemes. So what you see here is kind of all of these things are required for you to look at if you do a risk assessment, as is shown here on the kind of the screenshot on the right is of the risk assessment, arguably too small for you to read, but I think it gives an indication of kind of what the paragraphs look like. And if you want to, look it up yourself, feel free to just Google EUDR regulation, and you'll find this really quickly and be able to scan through it. But of course, hopefully this webinar will give you all of the information that you need. But just to give you an idea that these are the things you need to focus on. So if you're doing a risk assessment, you're, for example, importing from Brazil, you need to consider, okay, is there a presence of indigenous people in the plot of land that I'm importing from? What are the governance characteristics? Is there a risk of corruption in the area I'm importing from? Are there issues in the value chain? Are people being underpaid? Is there a risk of modern slavery? Are these kind of things you need to consider, and you need to substantiate them with the relevant documentation. And then also the history of non-compliance plays into that, because if the company you're buying from has been shown to kind of tweak data or to work with documentation that is not correct, then you have to be stricter of that in the future. Moving to the definition of negligible versus non-negligible. So here we really go into kind of the definition of, okay, what does it mean when, for example, you've looked at the presence of indigenous people in the plot of land that you've identified, and you see that there's an overlap of the plot of land and the presence of indigenous people, that already classifies it as being non-negligible, so meaning that you have to look into it further. Let's give a quick definition of non-negligible, or a definition of a negligible risk, which states that after a thorough review of all product-specific and general information, and after applying any needed mitigation, there's no cause for concern that the product fails EUDR's deforestation or legality requirements. And here, kind of the no cause for concern is really important, because it means you have to be really sure about every step that you've taken, and there's kind of no area for interpretation or uncertainty. Which also brings us to the point of EUDR thresholding, which means kind of what is the threshold of a negligible risk. This means that the threshold stands that if an operator cannot conclude a risk is negligible, then by law, the risk is non-negligible, triggering further measures. There is no middle ground or medium risk allowance. So essentially, if you cannot be sure of kind of complete negligibility, and you're unsure about something, that means it's non-negligible, and you have to move on to paragraph 11 and then specifically tackle those issues where you're unsure. Of course, it doesn't mean that you have to open the book on everything that you've assessed. It only requires you to look at the specific elements of these non-negligible risks. Furthermore, you also kind of have to consider this all or nothing approach. Operators cannot average out risks. So if you have 10 kind of identified risks and 9 of them are negligible and 1 of them is non-negligible, that doesn't mean that you can say, well, we're 90% negligible, so we can move on. You have to still move on to that Article 11 for the risk assessment of that one risk that's non-negligible. A little bit of a visualization of what that would look like for a company importing certain products. On the left-hand side, we have non-negligible risks. On the right-hand side, it's the negligible risks. So let's say, for example, a company in the first example has a geolocation which shows no deforestation based on the satellite imaging. The legal documents have been provided, but the country has high risk of corruption and bribery, then you have to move on to Article 11. For the second example, you look at a company where the legal documents have been provided, but the geolocation shows plot is in a protected area, so it overlaps with a protected area. That also means you have to do a risk mitigation assessment as part of Article 11. And then the third one, here you also see that for most of it, they do comply, so that the geolocation shows no deforestation. There's legal ownership documents which have been provided, and the existing claims from indigenous people on indigenous land have been proven to be trespassing, which then means that only on the third kind of point here, you need to do a risk mitigation assessment to ensure that all of these steps have been taken to work together with indigenous people and make sure that they're not kind of suffering from the deforestation or linked to the commodities that you're buying. And then over to Article 11, which is risk mitigation. What does that mean in practice? So if a risk is non-negligible, companies must adopt risk mitigation procedures to achieve no negligible risk. So what that means essentially is there's several things that I mentioned here. One of them is to provide additional data, info, and documents. And this can, for example, be the creation of a free prior informed consent document with indigenous people, or in case of high corruption, a document which provides when or by who the files were produced. So just to give the necessary context, so imagine you have an auditor going through it. What kind of additional documentation do they need to certify that you've taken all the necessary steps and done the necessary research to certify that this is no risk? Then for the independent audits, I think this is relatively clear. But for example, what that could mean is that you go into the field with an expert to show that it's undisputed land, which is also part of EUDR in itself. To kind of every plot of land based on kind of the risk level has to be reviewed every now and then. I think it's a percentage of the plots that have to be reviewed, and I think it's based on kind of these checks, these random checks that are done. But of course, you can also verify this yourself by going with an independent auditor that maybe is active in the country that you're importing from. And then for the other measures to satisfy Article 9, this considers anything like anything that helps resolve issues with suppliers or landowners. For example, helping the suppliers untangling EUDR commodities for export, as sometimes exporters have several EUDR commodities that they ship as part of the same shipment, which makes it really hard to untangle what's part of what. For example, you have wood, but you also have cocoa. You need to make sure that those are kind of distinguishable from each other in terms of shipments. So you can help your suppliers with those steps. But of course, a last option as part of other measures is to look for new suppliers. So to switch suppliers that are in line with the EUDR requirements. Now I'm going to give the word to Elisabeth, who will take you kind of through the more practical layers of the risk assessment and break it down for you in kind of more practical terms. Once again, any questions that you may have throughout the webinar, just drop them in the question box on the bottom right, and we'll get back to them at the end.
Nice. Thank you very much, Jasper. So yeah, indeed, we're going to go now a little bit more technical, and just to make it a little bit more fun, we are going to use a case study from two weeks ago, in order to see how risk assessment will look in practice. So last time we introduced Choco Wonders, which is a chocolate manufacturer in the Netherlands, and I will give a brief snapshot for the ones that were not in our previous webinar. So we have this company that sources from two different countries, Ghana and Ivory Coast, and we discussed last time that they are sourcing from two cooperatives, and each cooperative has 10 small farmers as part of their sourcing stream. Then this company now is preparing for EUDR, and now they have to start applying Article 10 and 11 requirements before selling the chocolate to the EU. On the right side, we see some requirements and challenges that Choco Wonders was facing last time, which was that initially they were not able to trace each product back to the origin, but they switched traceability systems, moving to segregation model per shipment. Then we said that they also didn't have any geolocation data, but by providing technology and GPS mapping, they're now able to get them from the farmers. Also, by involving all this technology, they now can do proper deforestation checks on all the plots of land. And lastly, scattered and incomplete documentation was resolved by providing clear guidance and processes on how to collect information. So now this set the basis for data collection, but what does this look like when we're moving on to risk assessment? So risk assessment might be in different levels and referring to different stakeholders in the process. So to make this a little bit more practical, we have grouped the risks into specific categories. We have country controls, we have risks related to social impact and human rights. Also, business practices are an important control to take into consideration. And lastly, there needs to be an assessment of all the supply chains involved within the products. And now we're going to go and deep dive into each one of them. Now, when we're talking about country controls, we mean about the country of production. And this information usually can be found online, and there is no need for supplier or farmer involvement. On the left side, we can see all the risks that are proposed based on Article 10 that Jasper informed about. And it can include things like the EU benchmarking, which sets a list for all countries and respective risk scoring. We also need to cross-check the risk in relation to forest presence and deforestation. This usually can happen through databases like Global Forest Watch, for example. Then we also need to assess the country's overall trustworthiness, and this can happen through taking corruption, bribery, war conflict, any sanctions in the country. Furthermore, we are going to check the legislative landscape of the country, which can happen through indicators like law enforcement or governance effectiveness. Furthermore, we also need to cross-check if any laws are existing in terms of environmental protection, indigenous land rights in general, and more. And usually this is one of the most challenging things to find, as they are scattered in different databases. So as Coolset, for example, we're trying to create a master file with all the information we can gather from different countries and industries. And lastly, you need to cross-check if there is respect and protection of land use rights and third-party rights in the country of production. This, for example, we have an example database, which is called Prindex, and you can assess land security. On the far right, you can see how each of the countries of the case study score. And of course, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I would like to pass you through three different sections. When it comes to forest presence, I use the Global Forest Watch database to show you that Ghana, for example, from 2000 to 2020 has a forest change of minus 0.1%, meaning that it has lost forest in the overall, while Ivory Coast has even a lower forest change, meaning that they have minus 6.9%. This should be highly concerning for you, and you should take into consideration that things are going on the negative side for these countries. But at the same time, we also have the CPI score, the corruption index, for example, and Ghana scores 43 out of the 100, or Ivory Coast 40 out of the 100. Of course, we can go through all the sections here, but just for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on these two, which is the corruption and governance effectiveness. Now, we see that something is going wrong in this section, so we have to customize mitigation for each particular issue. Mitigation on this section will apply for all plots of lands that are in these countries. And here are some examples of how to work around this. When it comes to corruption in a country, you can, for example, ask your compliance team to verify all the documents with authorities in each country of production, or you can ask your suppliers how they arrived at this document, how these documents were issued. And why is this important? Because you can cross-check if corruption has happened in the meantime. Also, similarly, when we're talking about governance effectiveness, you can cross-check all the evidence with independent sources, like a certification, for example. Moving on to social impact and human rights, this has to do with each plot of origin and each order. Here we need to assess risks like presence of indigenous people in the country of production, but also in the plot of land, as well as all the particular land rights in the plot of land for indigenous people. And lastly, all the labor and human rights for the workers in the farms. This could be, for example, asking questions about the wages, working conditions, child labor, and more. And for our example, we can see that we have Ghana and Ivory Coast, both high presence of indigenous people in the country in general. And then just for the sake of the example, let's say that plot 1 seems to have indigenous people there, and it is eligible for the need of a free prior informed consent document, but they don't have it available. Well, Ivory Coast, we did our check and we saw that wages are below average. Now we're going to move on to assessing the risks for this particular section. So how do we deal with these risks? High presence in general in the country of production is not by itself a risk for the plot, but you still need to run your due diligence and make sure that there are indeed no indigenous people in the land. How can you do this? For example, by verifying public land registries for any possible presence of indigenous people. On the example of knowing that there are indigenous people in the area, in Ghana, in the Ghana plot, you can go talk to your supplier and request the creation of a specific document that makes sure that the indigenous people are respected. Lastly, when it comes to labor and human rights and the issue we had with the Ivory Coast plot, you can request, for example, payroll information from the cooperative or the farmer in order to confirm if these waste levels are too low. And then, of course, you need to move on to extra mitigation actions if indeed there is an issue with this particular part. Then when we're moving on to business practices, some of the most important things to take into consideration is data availability, data and document availability, and responsible business practices. To do this, you can check how many of the documents that you expect to receive. And when it comes to business practices, one of the best ways to do it is to run a media analysis and see. If we take this example now of Ghana and Ivory Coast, we can see that Ghana didn't provide all the documents that needed, but just the legality ones, while in the case of Ivory Coast, the problem is that there was a past deforestation claim, for example. Now, how to deal with this type of issues? On the document side, you can ask if these extra documents exist. If yes, you can request them, and if not, you can ask them and help them essentially collect this data themselves so that they can provide them to you. Then when it comes to responsible business practices, you can request formal reports showing that the issue was resolved by law, for example. Then lastly, we have supply chain, and supply chain controls need to happen on the supplier level. So you are having an overview of what is happening on the upstream supply chain. These risks might include supply chain complexity, like how many countries are there involved and how many actors are involved. Mixing with unknown origins, and you can do this by asking essentially your supplier how they're handling the materials, the EUDR related materials. Then traceability, what are the systems that your suppliers are using? How do they ensure this traceability is ensured? Stage of processing, how many countries, for example, are involved in the processing of the materials? As the higher the countries, the higher the risk. And lastly, circumvention. So you can check products being moved in countries that are not involved at all in the production or manufacturing of the materials. So now here we're going to cross-check what mitigation looks like for the last two examples, where for the first one, Ivory Coast plot seems that they process materials in 3 countries before they arrive to Choco Wonders in the Netherlands. This should concern you a bit, so asking the suppliers why the materials moved across these countries and for which step of the processing, and understanding more can help you see if there is any risk or not in reality. And then when it comes to circumventions and Ghanaian supplier passing through 3 different countries the materials, you can mitigate this risk by requesting all the transport and transfer documents to verify why this happened and if anything is going wrong throughout this process that then should trigger even further mitigation actions, which should be customized to each case, of course. Now, we did this overview of all the risks, and I think one thing that is very obvious is how complex the structure is, and that many times we have risks on a plot level, other times on supplier level, different risks, different contexts. So here is what we propose that you can do in order to structure your assessments in an efficient way. First of all, you have data needs, and the data needs are usually referring to different actors like suppliers, producer, your internal teams. So we suggest that you group this by source. Then you can refer to each group of information instead of each individual data point every time. Then we also saw that many of the risks are on plot level, and you don't have to essentially recreate the information every time you come across this plot, but you can reuse this static data across all and the same process for suppliers. As we said, that we have some set of information that are unique to each supplier, and every time you see this supplier on your orders base, you know, and you can reuse the same information. And lastly, risks, of course, can be checked one by one, but for contextual purposes, so for you to understand how to better mitigate, for example, it's nice if you can group them by the geography. So for example, country, or by actor, so knowing that this has to do with my direct supplier, this has to do with the farmer, etc., etc., and then you can simplify the patterns around risk mitigation. Now, of course, many people will be wondering, what if I am a downstream operator or trader, and how does this process look like for me? Of course, non-SME downstream operators and traders need to have a due diligence system in place, but this is much simpler than the one that starts and sits at the first step of the chain. The main difference is that if you are a downstream operator or trader, you don't need to conduct the risk assessment process from scratch. What you do have to do instead is, first you have to assess your supplier's maturity. So essentially your risk assessment is, how good of a job is my supplier doing in creating this process from scratch. So assessing collecting the data, assessing the risks, mitigating the risks. If you agree then that they do a good job and they are mature enough on the EUDR topic, instead of gathering the information for the risk assessment, this time you gather the due diligence statement numbers from the suppliers upstream, which essentially cross-check that they have done this on your behalf. Then you submit new due diligence statements, and this time, instead of referencing all this information we talked about, you just reference the upstream due diligence statements. One point before I move on, because this is extremely important, is that you carry the full responsibility still, even if you are downstream. So if one of the upstream due diligence statement is wrong, you're also responsible, and you cannot just say, I just reuse the information from my supplier, because the auditor will ask you, how did you cross-check that this information are correct? And this can look like the maturity assessment that I just talked about, or you might want to even do spot checks on your orders from your suppliers. Now, I would like to leave you with some final recommendations. So first of all, we said, avoid duplicating information by reusing data across batches, shipments, suppliers, or origins. So try to organize the information in the way that they feed your orders by not needing to go case by case. Then it is very important to develop templates, checklists, a coherent risk scoring mechanism, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to organize effectively the information. Also, it is very important to document every mitigation action that you do. So all these examples we said about Choco Wonders, they will have to write them down, have documentation available, which is part of your audit trail if you're being asked to justify your actions on one order. Then, in case you have missing or uncertain information, please treat them as a non-negligible risk. As in the case of an audit, saying that you just couldn't find the information will not be enough. Lastly, you might have to support your suppliers while they are getting EUDR ready. many of the suppliers will not have the information, or they will not know what the information are. And sometimes it's the EU side responsibility to provide the data that are needed, train them, maybe even provide tools for them. And I would like to leave you with this statistic, which says that 3.2% of the top 50 companies with the most exposure to global deforestation risk were the only ones that took credible action to remove deforestation from their supply chains in 2024. And this shows that even companies with the highest exposure and will be the ones that really will face the risks if deforestation goes any further from here, only 16 out of the 500 were actually doing something about it. So I think it's time that we start taking this more seriously and the risks and mitigate the risks, not only for deforestation per se, but also to maintain the mainstream services. Now, before we move on to the Q&A, we're gonna ask you one last question, and this is: how are you conducting? Are you thinking of conducting your risk assessments? So, are you taking it on a step-by-step, case-by-case approach, so you don't have a streamlined process yet? Are you thinking of conducting assessments through Excel's, drives, and emails and information, or are you thinking of onboarding a software solution, maybe? And lastly, maybe you're not reporting, of course. So yeah, from the people that are reporting, we see that many, 29% actually are thinking of onboarding a solution, which I think made sense. And then at the same time, we also have people that are still thinking of conducting assessments through Excel and drives. I feel like both can work for sure. And we see that now it's a tie between these two options. And I feel like this depends, of course, to your special case, how complex is your order base, how complex is your supply chain, where do you source from, and what are your needs and capacity of the team. So yeah, I think that's the last one of our slides. So we can move on to our Q&A, and back to you, Jasper.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I've seen a lot of really interesting questions coming in, and also quite complex. So good that you asked them. I think most of these questions I'll give to Elizabeth, who is our in-house EUDR expert, especially when it comes to kind of the process and the small details. First question here, which I'll put on the screen for everyone to read as well, is from Edita, and asks, all this is again very complex and robust. Do you, with your current knowledge of the process, believe this will work in practice? Is it feasible, or shall we expect similar as with ESRS, i.e. robust and complex reporting standards now being dramatically changed to simplified?
Yeah, can I take it?
Yeah, please.
Nice. So I think as seeing our company incorporating this in practice, I would actually like to refer to a conversation we had internally.
Sorry, one slide more.
Yes, sorry. Of course. Yes. Now you can see also our final slide. So we had this internal conversation where we saw the final data collection survey that we created for our suppliers. And then in the end, we all agreed that, okay, this is much simpler in the end than we thought. So I think, and of course, risk assessment is robust and complex, but it can be grouped into different levels. And when you start grouping and you start thinking of things in boxes like country, for example, information is something very static. You're going to find it once for all countries and that's it. Then plot information will be a little bit more tricky because you will have to work on its plot. Most probably will have different information, and there you have to spend most of your time. And then your supply chain is also an assessment that you should do once, and it's nice to do for the general risk assessment of your company, not only EUDR. So what I want to say is that I think you can systematize this in a way that it will not be that complex, and you're only gonna get flagged the things that really mean something to you. Then data collection, if you take it completely granular and you see what your suppliers need to give you as information, it seems less complex than what it sounds like. But yeah, I'm not gonna lie and say that this is the most easy thing to do. And yeah, when it comes to if we are expecting to see something as ESRS, I think there are conversations around EUDR, which mainly are referring right now to the risk categorization of the country. So I haven't seen any conversations around changing fundamentally how we do this process. But yeah, we might see some differentiation in the classification of its country. And I hope I answer your question because this is like a very broad topic, of course.
Yeah, I think to add to that, we're looking at Brussels a lot and looking at the changes that they're making in terms of the omnibus proposal. And of course, now we're also kind of tracking to see if anything will happen with EUDR. And we've spoken to some people in Brussels, politicians and policy experts, and they've also said that right now it only looks like they're going to change, or they're looking to change the risk classification to kind of open up that conversation. But that is not for now, it's not a way to break open the conversation even further. So with the information we have today, we're expecting everything to just go on as planned. Question from Lydia. Also a question for Elizabeth. If my supplier is not in the EU, should they still create a due diligence statement in Traces, which is kind of the EU platform for submitting it, so I can use it for importing into the EU, or other due diligence statements formats are accepted too? If another format, how do I transfer it to have a due diligence statement in Traces?
Yeah, so if your supplier is not in the EU, you are the first one in line from the EU side. So you are the one that is responsible to create the due diligence statement in Traces, and you should collect the information from your supplier, assess the risks, mitigate the risk, and then in the end go to Traces and fill this. So maybe your supplier has some information, but it will not be a DDS for sure, as they cannot even log in because you need EU credentials to log in into Traces. But yeah, essentially you are the one that has to do the first due diligence statement, and you are not a downstream operator, but a first in-line operator.
Great. And then I have a question here from Charlotte. I think also a question that you're well equipped to answer, Elizabeth. How do you deal with risk assessments on supplier basis, considering that EUDR requires risk assessments on a product/material basis? Do you add up the product risks for a supplier risk?
Yeah, so I think how we're planning on approaching this is that every time I see an order, I see specific components like a product, a supplier, a plot of origin. And each of these has the subsequent risks that we discussed. So I check each risk on each of the contextual groups we discussed, which adds up to the final order. So essentially, we don't care. The order is the final output, but what we care is the plots, the suppliers, the producers, and the products. So I hope this answers your question.
Great. Another question here from Job. Is it possible to give an update on the political process of the EUDR? Yeah, last webinar we gave a bit of an insight into what we're seeing in Brussels. Not much has changed since then, so they're kind of now in summer recess, which means that until September, not a lot will happen in Brussels. But when they come back, I'm sure we're going to see the ball start to roll again. And for now, what is planned is kind of a revision of the risk assessment classification system. So right now, there's a system developed by the European Union that has all of the countries in the world, and every country has a risk classification. So either low, medium, or high risk. And they were saying back then, it doesn't really make sense that there's only 4 high-risk countries that amount to a marginal amount of kind of the exports of EUDR commodities. And it also doesn't make sense that some countries which have really their kind of everything in order are classified as standard or low risk, when some should be a lower risk, even lower than lower, which is a bit of a confusing term, but it would put them at a no risk category, which is something that's being discussed. But for now, that's more of an agenda item than something that's actually going to happen. And when we know more, we'll be sure to share it through our LinkedIn channels. So be sure to follow us on the Coolset LinkedIn, but also Elizabeth and I on our personal accounts share these things frequently. So feel free to follow us as well. Hope that answers it. I see we're nearing the end of our time, so I propose we answer 2 more questions, and the other ones we haven't answered, we'll be sure to get back to you over email and answer your question there. Let me see. Let me democratize this a bit and look at the most voted questions. I see here a question from Laura with 4 upvotes. Can an FSC certification still be considered a form of risk mitigation, even if we only purchase FSC certified products and it has become our internal standard?
Yes, of course. So that's a very interesting question because there are a lot of people thinking that certifications can be their way out of risk assessment and mitigation. So essentially, certification can help you justify other risks as lower. That is how we approach it at Coolset. Of course, there is a very clear section in the FAQ that says that certifications by themselves cannot be considered a ticket out of things. However, what you can do is that if your supplier fails in a specific section, like, for example, wages and policy and child labor and everything, you can use as an extra layer of information that FSC has the labor and human rights assessment that they do. And if your supplier becomes FSC certified, then you have an extra external validation that they indeed do what they promise they do. So of course you can use this in other cases, but it cannot, for example, substitute the deforestation check through satellite or other more technical parts of EUDR. So more as an add-on to their answers themselves as suppliers.
Perfect. And then the last question here with 3 upvotes from Lydia. Do SMEs have to do this risk assessment and mitigation process as well?
Yes. So if you are the first in line, so if you're an SME that imports from outside of the EU the commodities, it doesn't matter that you are an SME, you still have to do the risk assessment and mitigation process. And the problem is that if you are the first one, there is no work being done before you. So the regulation cannot justify you doing less of a due diligence process before importing the materials. Now, if you're a downstream SME, so you take the materials from another EU entity, then you don't have to do risk assessment or mitigation, and also you don't have to resubmit due diligence statements when you are going to place the materials in the market. But we're going to talk more about this in the next session when it comes to due diligence statements as well.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think as Elizabeth just mentioned, in 2 weeks we'll have our next session on the due diligence statement. For those that have registered to the EUDR summer school, that means you've automatically registered to all 3 sessions, so you'll get the links and the reminders in your inbox as well. For now, thanks so much everyone for attending. We have our email addresses here in the slide, should you have any more questions that you want to follow up on. We also have the QR code here for our EUDR waitlist. Should you be one of the companies that's interested in using software for EUDR, feel free to join the waitlist, and we'll reach out once we have it live in the next couple of weeks. For now, thanks everyone for attending, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thanks everyone.